for my lesson, I'm going to be going more into the inductive learning model. And for the inductive learning, this is one of the models that goes all the way back to Aristotle. And Aristotle believed that man is a rational human being and that man has the ability to learn through disciplined inquiry. And that idea was built upon later, and Vygotsky was one of the theorists who looked at this idea of knowledge being a social process, and people are able to construct new knowledge through their curiosity and exploration, but that needs to be guided. And in order for new connections to be made, they also need to have the ability to interact with each other. So taking this inherent idea from Aristotle and building upon it, this is where we get the idea of an inductive learning environment. And so just to help with the visualization, inductive is when students are provided with specific examples, and then from those specific examples, they come to the general rule. And that's opposite of deductive learning. Deductive is when students are provided with the general rule, and then from there, they work with specific example. So inductive learning really is that exploration process, and students are forced to make those connections on their own. In order for inductive learning to be successful, it really is more about the classroom environment, because inductive learning is something that can take place in any content area at any grade level. So it's more about the structure as opposed to the topic. So for the classroom environment, students need to be able to work in pairs. Vygotsky really looked at that social interaction, and so providing a classroom environment through seating or through the pairing of students, that is essential, making sure students have the opportunity to collaborate. Allow students to voice their thoughts. So whether that is working in their pairs, sharing, collaborating, as well as also speaking out in a whole group discussion so they can share what they are thinking with the teacher, so that way they can be guided in their thoughts. So that way the teacher can check in and make sure they are on track with their discovery process. Make sure time is being considered. In order for students to get through an inquiry lesson through the inductive learning process, it's important that they are provided an adequate amount of time to explore and discuss their thoughts. If time is not provided, the discussion is going to be limited and the connections are going to fall short. So in order for an inquiry lesson to take place, for the inductive learning to happen, there are key steps to any lesson. Again, it can happen in any grade level or with any content. So it's more about the steps as opposed to a specific content. So the first is that students need to be given examples, and these examples can be provided on slips of paper, through pictures, through videos, through books. So they need to be provided with the examples. Once they are given the examples, it is their responsibility to draw the conclusions. So they're working to compare and contrast, find the similarities between all of these different examples. And so they will work to arrange them into groupings. Once they have their groups, they need to then move into the third step, which is to label their groups. Make the justification for why they grouped the items the way they did. The fourth step is they need to draw some sort of conclusions about their groups. So for what purpose did they put those like items together. And the fifth step is, are they able to move the groups about in a new way? Sometimes during this process, students may not draw the same conclusions as the teacher had originally intended. And that is because everyone comes with different background experiences, and that's okay. So a student might have a different experience and might group items in a different way. And that is why they might then be asked at the end to go back and try to regroup items. So why go through this process? What is the rationale behind conducting this type of lesson, an inductive lesson? There are three main components. Another theory that ties into this would be Bloom's. And while we look at the Common Core state standards, the goal is to be pushing students into those higher tiers, into the analysis, the evaluating, the creative components. And if students are engaging in an inductive lesson, they really are reaching those higher levels. And one of the reasons is because they are engaging in the inferencing process. They are trying to draw conclusions and make those connections, and they have to infer based on the evidence that is in front of them. They are not given all the information. They have to draw the connections and the comparisons themselves based on their previous knowledge and background experiences. They are engaged in evidence-based discussions. They have to use the information on the table to have the conversations they are having with their peers. And having those evidence-based discussions are vital for building their academic vocabulary and their success in the classroom. And the final one is improving their academic vocabulary. They are being exposed to terminology and vocabulary that they may not be used to, and so it is building and improving their academic vocabulary. So not only in an English classroom, which is where most people think about vocabulary acquisition, they're improving maybe their science vocabulary because they're having to use those words in their discussion piece. They could be building their math vocabulary and really understanding some of those terminologies as they are having these discussions. So they're no longer just words on a piece of paper or words in instructions. They have to use them to make those connections and use them in their defense. So what are some of the benefits to inductive learning? The first one is that students are active in the lesson, which means they're active in their learning process. And one of the ways teachers can make sure that all students are involved is through the way they structure their classroom and their pairs. So pairing would allow all students to have a voice. So if your groups become too big, that can allow some students to be more passive, so making sure your group sizes stay small. Students are able to make meaningful connections to the material at hand. They are all coming from different experiences and backgrounds, so they are able to make connections that maybe you were not able to see, or maybe that you as an educator were not intending. But everyone is bringing in their previous knowledge and working together to make meaningful groups of the material in front of them. And it's cognitively stimulating for all the students. Again, is pushing students into those higher levels of Bloom's and forcing students to think more meaningfully about the content in front of them. So just an idea for a lesson, I chose the topic of fairy tales, and the reason I chose this topic is because I feel like it's an area that can be adapted for an elementary classroom as well as a high school classroom. I chose to do a lesson for a middle school classroom because I teach middle school. And then the idea is to put this lesson at the very beginning of a unit because it allows best for the exploration process. They're able to bring in their previous knowledge but we have not gone too far into it where all the information has already been learned. So they really still are investigating, and the duration would be a 2 to 3 day process. And so the purpose would be for them to embed ultimately the common literary elements that they find throughout this inquiry into an original fairy tale that they would create at the end. So the process of this would be having stations set up around the classroom, and each station would have a different picture book that is a fairy tale. And the reason I would go with a picture book would be the purpose is for them to be looking at commonalities in literary elements as opposed to just reading and understanding the vocabulary of the story itself. So by using picture books, it adds a fun element and allows them to focus on something besides just the content of the story. So having them work in groups, go through and start noting the similarities between the stories. As they go through, categorize the literary elements. So in order to do this, they have to have a background knowledge of literary elements. So plot, character, conflict, setting, in order to have an appropriate discussion. And then discuss their importance and their role in the story. So something that I take note in for inquiry lessons and inductive learning lessons, as I've watched lessons and as I've implemented these types of lessons, it's important to check in with students. So I would not have them go through the entire rotation and then have a whole group discussion. I would have students do maybe 2 or 3 rotations and then start to have a discussion, check in, see how things are going. So that way, if students are stuck, they can hear from their peers, as well as make sure that students are understanding what is going on throughout the process. That way, if they're really off in one direction, I can rein them back in. And at the very end, for the categories, and this would require them to think a little bit more deeply, after we generate a master list of similarities, whittle that down to a top 3 or a top 4. So this then requires them to go back and prioritize what are the most essential elements. So go back through, find the similarities, now go back and prioritize what elements are most essential to making a fairy tale, and then use those predetermined items decided by the class to then embed into their rubric that they will use to then write their own original fairy tale. By going through this process, they are determining what is the most meaningful, and they have determined what is most meaningful by going through the process themselves, as opposed to me just coming out and saying, okay, this is what's essential in a fairy tale, and here is what I'm expecting you to have. So they have determined it themselves as a class, as a collaborative experience. So going through this process and knowing that this is one of the models that can be implemented K through 12 and across all subject areas, I'm curious to see how you have incorporated inductive learning into your classroom, as well as what are some of the benefits you have seen to the inductive learning process, as well as there are 2 sides to every coin. What are some of the drawbacks you have seen to inductive learning? So I'm curious to see what you say, and I look forward to hearing from you.